Hello, you're all very welcome to our discussion this evening, and we're continuing our discussion on Moses chapter 1 about the vision that Moses had and the encounter he has with the adversary afterwards. And so we're picking it up in verse 17, verse 18?
Verse 18.
But before we do, just to put the background here, Moses has had the first part of his vision. Now he's seeing the adversary, and the adversary has made some claims, and Moses has rejected those claims. But now the adversary is starting to get a bit more hostile, and Moses has to respond accordingly. So maybe would you take 18 and I'll do 19?
And again Moses said, I will not cease to call upon God. I have other things to inquire of him, for his glory has been upon me. Wherefore I can judge between him and thee. Depart hence, Satan.
And now, when Moses had said these words, Satan cried with a loud voice, and ranted upon the earth, and commanded, saying, I am the only begotten. Worship me. All right. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so this is interesting to me. Moses is saying, I won't cease to call upon God. I'm going to continue to pray. Even though he had great revelations already to this point, and this particular experience, he had great insights and revelations, he still had other questions to ask. He had other answers to obtain. He was a seeker. He was a desirer. He was someone who longed for more truth. That teaches us a great lesson that notwithstanding all the revelations we've had in the past, we welcome more, we seek more, and we go direct to the source. We go to God, our Father in heaven, and we ask him those things that we're desirous to know and to learn about for the welfare of our soul. He does say that the glory of God has been upon him, which I think is a wonderful statement. We know that the prophet Joseph Smith said something similar, that the glory of God needs to come upon us in these sorts of divine encounters to protect us because of the power of God, but also to magnify us, to give us an increase in knowledge and understanding. And then he said he could discern between God and Satan. He could tell the difference. He could see the glory of God, and that Satan was not a being of glory and light. So there's a big contrast between those. And then, of course, he told Satan to leave, depart, leave me. I want to be with God. Great advice there for ourselves, that we can seek to remove the adversary from our lives and move closer to our Father in heaven, and always come back to him, even though we've had many experiences with him. Come back, keep coming back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. As you've pointed out, Moses refused to cease to call upon God, and in a way that was the adversary's intent. He was attempting to sever Moses from the powers of heaven, because that would have assured a greater destruction for Moses than it would have before. But Moses is wise. This is what the devil tells him could have, if he let it, destroyed his faith. But he responded the right way. I don't have to trust you just because you say something. I don't have to believe you just because you claim to be the only begotten. It reminds me of something the Lord said in the Sermon on the Mount about how many would say in the day of judgment, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And he responds, he never knew me. And so the idea is that there are people who can believe and do believe that they represent the Lord that actually don't, or others who claim to represent the Lord, being false prophets or false messiahs or false teachers. And Moses is wise enough to say, no, that's rubbish, I don't believe it. And so he responds the right way, and he continues to call upon God. The devil wouldn't have inspired him to pray. So this is an evidence that the Spirit was with him. He will not cease to call upon God. And then, of course, the devil's display, as Elder Holland points out in one of his great speeches, Cast Not Away Therefore Your Confidence. This is a dismal performance, but it's also somewhat intimidating. And Moses, in the next verse we'll see, Moses didn't have a nice experience here, but the adversary shows his true colors, that he will rant and rave and throw a tantrum because he was refused. He was exposed. This shows us the kind of being that the devil is. He's not a noble man. He's not a good one. He's not interested in our salvation. He's interested in power. He's a corrupter. And it's a good way to reveal that. He, in a sense, he had to show his true nature. And so, yeah, some interesting things.
And I love that. I love the idea that he says, I am the only begotten, worship me. Because that reminds me of the encounter in the Grand Council where Christ offered himself as Jehovah to be the Messiah, and where Lucifer offered himself, and he was rejected. So he wanted to be the only begotten. He wanted to be the Son of God in the flesh. At that time he was denied. But still, he's still holding on to that, because this is much, much later. This is much later in human history, obviously, where he still has that same desire. He wants to be worshipped, as you've said. He wants to be the number one, wants to be the star of the show, if you like. So it's so important to understand that his motives are self-seeking, they're vain. And we can always judge something by that. Is this vanity? Is this desire I have? Is it to the glory of God? Or is it to my own grandeur? Is it to my own praise? Whose kingdom am I trying to build? And that's the difference between Christ and Satan. Satan wanted glory, whereas Christ wanted to give the glory to the Father.
Absolutely. Excellent. Will you take 21? Will you take 20 and I'll take 21, please?
And it came to pass that Moses began to fear exceedingly, and as he began to fear, he saw the bitterness of hell. Nevertheless, calling upon God, he received strength, and he commanded, saying, Depart from me, Satan, for this one God only will I worship, which is the God of glory.
And now Satan began to tremble, and the earth shook. And Moses received strength, and called upon God, saying, In the name of the only begotten, depart hence, Satan. And it came to pass that Satan cried with a loud voice, with weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And he departed hence, even from the presence of Moses, that he beheld him not. So, what are your thoughts on these verses?
So these are very powerful verses, because we know that when Moses saw the true colors of the adversary, we saw him having a temper tantrum and the anger, and he was afraid. And that's an experience I think we can resonate with, because when we're young children, we don't like anger. We don't like people shouting and noise, and we don't like things that cause us to fear. And so that idea of he was afraid, and I can totally understand that. And as he began to fear, he saw the bitterness of hell, which I understand to mean that he saw what it was like. He got a bit of a glimpse for Satan to be lost, to be perdition, to be damned, that Satan was damned, that he couldn't progress. And the sense of bitterness that goes with that is a terrible thing that you wouldn't wish on anyone. And of course, Moses didn't like that. He didn't like seeing the bitterness of hell. It was a scary thing, and I can totally understand that. When we see people, and this is a very particular situation, of course, if we see people who are really in the depth of misery, that's scary. And so he's witnessing this personally. This isn't abstract. He isn't removed. He's involved in this relational experience. But nevertheless, he called upon God, and God gave him strength. God gave him an impetus, an injection of power, and something, a power to endure. And he commanded, then Moses commanded Satan, saying, "Leave me, depart from me. I'm only going to worship God, the God of glory. I'm not going to worship you. I'm not going to worship man. I'm not going to worship idols. I'm going to worship my Father in heaven and his Son." And that was a powerful testimony, that Moses was bearing his testimony to the devil, saying, "No, I'm going to follow God."
Absolutely.
And then, of course, as we know, other things unfolded there where the earth shook. Satan began to tremble. He started to get nervous or started to get afraid. It's an interesting description. Moses received more strength, and then called upon God and said, "In the name of the only begotten, depart hence." And I think you probably like to comment on that, so I won't say anything about it. But I think that's a marvelous experience, that Moses was able to receive the power of God, which enabled him to conquer his enemy, so that he wasn't led away captive.
Definitely. Yeah, and you've hit on a good point about the fear. Moses experienced fear when he saw this display before him. And sometimes we forget that we're here in mortality to experience the range of human emotions. We'd be happy to just live our lives in bliss and not experience any dissatisfaction or sorrow or rejection or fear or be repulsed by evil. And in a way, I think that's part of this. How can you see the bitterness of hell without seeing evil? Hell is an evil place with evil people. And so it's bitter to the righteous, and the punishments thereof are exceedingly bitter. So what Moses experienced here wasn't just by accident. This was, the Lord allowed this to happen so that Moses could understand something of fear. We presume Christ felt this when he went to go to the atonement. We know that he sweat drops of blood, and it's linked to the idea that he was trembling, he had trepidation, he was fearful of it.
Anguish.
Absolutely, these aren't small things, and
absolutely not.
And faith doesn't rule out other experiences. It means you can abide them, and that's the key. That's something people often forget. Faith doesn't necessarily mean you won't have fear. It means you'll be able to survive through your fears. And Moses does that. And as you pointed out, he does it by calling upon God. And God gives him strength. And where does he get that strength? Well, he gets it from the only begotten. And then in that very name, in the name of the only begotten, he casts out Satan.
Which was the first time that Satan actually left.
Yes. And it's by the right power, by the right authority. Moses has, before this, in a way, he's been giving his reasons why he won't give in to the devil, but now he says firmly, it's time for you to leave. And he does it in the name of the only begotten. And when he does that, Satan has to flee. He cannot abide. and he in a way in this account was maybe putting his feathers up, making himself look bigger than he was by this display of outrageous behavior. But the moment the name of the only begotten is used with authority, he has to go.
And I think he's also infuriated because he's been called out, because he's counterfeiting. As we know, Satan tries to counterfeit Christ. He tries to resemble him. He appears as an angel of light, as a deceiver. And in this account, I think he's called out by Moses. Moses said, "No, I know the true only begotten." And I'm saying, "You're not him." And so Satan is infuriated by that reality.
His deception was exposed by a prophet.
Yes.
And this is what the prophets always do. They point out, this is wrong, this is a sin, this is a lie, this is not the way of the Lord. And people hate them for it. They've always hated them for it. That's why so many prophets have been killed. So much righteous blood has been shed. Because the prophets have a very offensive message, really, in a way, because it always involves the message of repentance.
Yes.
And that people sin. Sin comes by the influence of the adversary. And it is increased. The severity of it is increased. And when we sin, it brings more of the influence of the adversary into our lives. And so when you go to a sinful people, they'll be more devilish, and they'll appreciate the message of the Lord less. So the prophets have always had to put up with people who have been more inclined to the ways of the devil, we might say, than the ways of the Lord. And Moses definitely experienced this. He went to the Pharaoh, who kept on hardening his heart. 10 times there were plagues poured out upon the Egyptians. And 9 of them, Pharaoh changed his mind. It's a bit mixed. Some of them he said, no. Others he started to say, yes, I will. But then he recanted, he hardened his heart. And then finally, he had to learn the very hard way with the loss of the firstborns. And then eventually he did. The people of Israel were hard-hearted. For 40 years, Moses had to lead a group of mourners into the promised land. His was a tough ministry, but this experience prepared him well for that. And it relates directly to what the Lord is about to tell him, because he overcomes. The Lord gives him added authority. He says, the waters will obey your command as if you were God. A clear reference to both the smiting of the rock, so the water came up, but also to the parting of the Red Sea.
Well, that's absolutely right. There's 2 things that strike me from what you've said. One is that sin always brings sadness. And Satan is the ultimate example of that, because he's miserable. He's in bitterness. He's in despair. And he's the ultimate sinner. So he has the ultimate despair. So that's the first idea. And of course, sin brings sadness not just to the person who commits it, but to other people who are impacted by it, which is why we have such a thing as victims. Victims of crime, victims of abuse. The reason we use the word victim is because they've been impacted negatively by someone else's poor choices. So there's no such thing as a private sin, in a sense. All the sins we have spill out over to others, which is what we're seeing here, that Satan, his character, his sinful nature, was causing upset for Moses. So there's always a relational impact in everything we do in life. And that leads me to the second thought, which is Moses observed the great contrast, as all prophets do. You were talking about prophets experiencing difficulty. They experience great spiritual highs on the mountaintop with the Lord, and great lows with the opposition of the adversary, just like this. We know that Moses encountered this. He met both God and Satan. So did Joseph Smith. And so did others that we could talk about who had this distinction, this deep contradiction between the beauty of meeting God, the great joy that comes from being in God's presence, and the great sadness and despair that comes from being in the presence of darkness. So I think it's a really educational experience for each of us to reflect on that and say, yeah, we've all had that encounter with joy and with bitterness. And as you've said, in mortality, we're to experience a range of emotions, and it's part of our education in the things of the Spirit.
Absolutely. And then the final verse we'll address is just 23. And now of this thing Moses bore record, but because of wickedness it is not had among the children of men. So the devil wanted it covered up in a way. He wanted his failure concealed. He wasn't too happy about losing this one. But of course, that doesn't work. All his purposes fail. All his desires fall short, because eventually, through the prophet Joseph, it was revealed. And it's a testimony to us that the devil will always fail. Sure, he'll get his kicks in. He's allowed to bruise our heel, as it were. But we rest in the assurance that his head will be bruised and eventually crushed. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, you're absolutely right about that. This idea that Moses wanted to bear record of this event. He didn't want to keep it hidden. He wanted people to know so they could be prepared and be warned. And this is a very dynamic experience. This is very powerful. And he wanted people to know. So we could be prepared, just like Joseph Smith told us the full account that he was attacked by the adversary and then he met God. There's an opposition in all things. So if we're going to have spiritual highs, we're going to have spiritual lows. We're going to have both the range of contrast. But also, as you've said, Satan tried to expunge that, to redact that from the record. Now, by various means, it doesn't tell us exactly how, but obviously it reminds me of the idea that plain and precious truths taken away from the Bible, sometimes intentionally, which have not served mankind well, because we want to know the truth. We want to know what's going on between good and evil. And so now this message has been restored. It's been brought back. The plainness has been made known in the light. And God has been revealed, and so has the devil. They're both for all to see the contrast between them, so that we're not deceived, so that we know where, we know who the source of our power is. We know who to look to. We don't need to be misled. And in the experiences we have in life, they won't be as dramatic as this probably, but there'll be a sign of it. There'll be a token. There'll be a type of this kind of experience. So we just need to reorient ourselves and remember to keep calling upon God, keep returning to Him, ask Him, seek Him, and recognize the evil one, his influence in our life, and push him away, resist.
Yeah, absolutely. These are great verses and great thoughts, and we appreciate that you could join us, and I hope to see you soon. So, bye.